For today's video, I want to share my experiences of keeping some cold water cherry shrimp tanks in my fish room during the British winter. During this period, the water temperature in all of these tanks hovered around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and while this may seem low, researchers have recorded water temperatures as low as 8 degrees Celsius or 46 degrees Fahrenheit in some of the natural habitats of Neocaridina shrimp. Now that it's late March and winter's basically over, I thought it would be a good opportunity to share my observations to help other people who are thinking of keeping heaterless shrimp tanks. Please note I am specifically talking about cherry shrimp and other Neocaridina shrimp variants in this video. Other species of shrimp will probably react differently to these temperatures. I'd like to start by talking about how the shrimp behaved in cold water, focusing on their activity levels. When I was researching unheated shrimp tanks, some people mentioned that their shrimp hardly moved at all during the winter. Now, while the exact water temperature will come into play, this really hasn't been my experience with these tanks. Although my shrimp did slow down their activity during the colder months, they still maintained their basic routine and was just at a slower pace. I want to cover breeding in more detail later in the video, but I suspect one reason that some people say their shrimp activity levels really dropped off is due to the reduced breeding rate in colder water. For those unfamiliar with the process, when a female Neocaridina shrimp is ready to breed, she releases pheromones after molting to signal her availability, which causes male shrimp to swim around the tank excitedly in search for her. With fewer breeding events during the winter, there's less of this frantic male activity going on, giving the impression that activity levels have dropped. But outside of this normal breeding behaviour, I'd guess my cherry shrimp maintained around 75% of their normal summertime activity levels and routine, despite the cooler water temperature. My shrimp in all of my unheated tanks will still happily explore their environments, forage for food, and there was plenty of stuff going on to be entertaining enough to watch during the cooler months of the year. Next, I want to discuss the shrimp's growth and molting rates, which have definitely slowed down during the colder months. For anyone who's unfamiliar with shrimp growth, they periodically molt out of their carapace to accommodate their increase in size, though older shrimp do tend to molt less frequently as their growth rate naturally slows down. Still, I have plenty of juvenile shrimp in some of these tanks and they are definitely growing at a slower pace than they did during the summer. But I honestly believe this is simply due to the cooler water temperatures rather than any health problems, because I have shrimp taken from these colonies in tropical tanks that are grown at a normal rate. Now, I do still see a few molts in the tank each week, but it's nowhere near the volume that I see during the warmer months of the year. And on a plus side, I haven't noticed any changes in the coloration of the shrimp, suggesting that there aren't any issues with the molting process or the chitin health on the shrimp, so everything seems to be fine. It's just happening at a far slower rate. Next, I want to talk about shrimp losses, because when I first decided to try heaterless shrimp tanks, my biggest concern was that I'd be constantly losing shrimp due to the cold, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this have the same concern. However, in my experience, the loss rate in my tanks has actually decreased compared to the summer months. Of course, I still find the occasional dead shrimp in my tanks, but that is to be expected, especially in my larger colonies. For example, my main unheated yellow Neocaridina tank and my 20 degrees Celsius cherry shrimp tank have around 100 shrimp in them now, and that is natural for older individuals in a colony of this size to reach the end of their lifespan. I actually have a little theory on why the shrimp losses seems to have slowed down in the colder months of the year. As far as I'm aware, the main cause of fatalities in adult shrimp is the molting process. As a shrimp gets older, it starts to struggle to correctly process the calcium and magnesium it requires to maintain a healthy carapace effectively. Even if your tank's water parameters are perfect, eventually older shrimp will run into problems and have a failed molt, which is a common issue amongst crustaceans. This essentially traps the shrimp in a carapace that's too small for it, resulting in a fatality. Since the shrimp's growth rate in these tanks seems to have slowed right down during the colder months, they are molten less frequently, reducing the chance of having a failed molt and in return lowering the mortality rate of the tank. That being said, I did lose the last of my adult orange Neocaridina shrimp over the winter months, but I really don't think this has anything to do with the cooler water temperature. If you're familiar with my channel, you might remember that unlike my cherry shrimp, Bloody Mary shrimp and yellow Neocaridina colonies, which have been hardy and very easy to keep, my orange Neocaridina shrimp struggled from the very beginning. I lost a lot of them during the summer months back when I first tried to get this colony going, and I suspect that the same issues are occurring during the winter months, and it's just coincidence that I lost the last of the adults during the cooler months of the year. Unfortunately, I suspect that they just came from a weaker genetic line rather than having any serious issues with them, and I do think if I could find a strong genetic line for orange Neocaridina shrimp, they would have been completely fine during the winter. Fortunately, the colony had started to breed before the last of the adults passed on, and I have managed to move their offspring over to this tank, and I'm hoping to raise them into a stronger, more resilient generation moving forward. The key takeaway here is that even if you do everything right in your tank, the hardiness of the specific colour of cherry shrimp or the specific line you get can play a significant role in your success. If you are new to the shrimp keeping hobby, I'd personally recommend that you start with either red cherry shrimp or yellow Neocaridina shrimp, because in my experience both have been very hardy. They're very cheap and they're very easy to find. While my Bloody Mary colony has also been easy to keep and hardy as well, they do seem to have a higher price tag, at least in my area, and it does push your initial costs up, so I'd go with one of the other two. Next, I want to talk about shrimp breeding during the winter months. As I mentioned earlier, breeding has definitely slowed down in my unheated tanks, but even in my tanks with smaller shrimp colonies, I do still see a buried female carrying eggs from time to time. I was actually quite surprised by this because a lot of the research that I did suggested that they would simply stop breeding if their temperature falls too low. That said, while I have seen plenty of buried females in my tanks, I haven't really noticed many baby shrimp going around looking for food. I'm not sure if this is because fewer babies are surviving in the cooler water temperatures, or if it's because their slow growth rate keeps them smaller for longer, making them harder to spot and more prone to hiding away in the coverage. The plants in my tanks have grown in a lot since the summer, providing more easily accessible hiding spots so the babies could simply be staying out of sight to avoid any potential predators while they are so small. Even though it's still technically winter because we're in mid-March at the time of recording, I've been noticing more saddled females, meaning they are carrying eggs in their ovaries, and the next time they molt I do expect them to breed, leading to more buried females carrying fertile eggs in my tank soon. Moving on, and we get to tank water parameters, which I'll break down into a few different sections, starting with water temperature. As I mentioned earlier, these tanks are all kept at room temperature other than the cherry shrimp tank, which I'm just showing in the video for B-roll footage. My fish room has relatively modern insulation which helps retain a lot of heat regardless of the central heating systems or anything like that. This means that tank temperature fluctuation is very small throughout the day, but changes are slow and gradual. Some of these tanks receive regular water changes too, especially those without any fast-grown plants, but I always check the water temperature of the specific tank I'm doing a water change on before I start the process. This lets me temperature match the new water that's going into that tank by adjusting the hot and cold taps to prevent any risk of shocking the shrimp. So overall, the temperatures remain stable in the tank even though they're around 7 degrees Celsius or 13 degrees Fahrenheit lower than their summer peaks, and the shrimp really don't seem to mind. Next, I want to discuss the nitrogen compounds, particularly ammonia and nitrite, as these are the ones that are toxic to shrimp. In aquariums, plants and microorganisms help regulate these compounds, though their effectiveness can drastically decrease in colder water temperatures. Until a couple of weeks ago, I was testing the water parameters of every single one of my tanks every single week, and it was partly because I was worried about potential ammonia and nitrite spikes, in my unheated tanks, but it's also partly out of habit. However, I'm happy to report that I haven't experienced any issues during the colder months of the year, and I haven't particularly done anything special to prevent them. When researching unheated aquariums, I did see a few discussions on forums and social media warning about how common ammonia and nitrite spikes are in cooler temperatures. While they can definitely happen, especially if you overfeed, I just haven't encountered this problem in my tanks. It is important to note that my shrimp in my room temperature tanks are usually kept with a small number of nanofish that also have a low bioload, minimizing risk. If you keep your shrimp with high bioload fish or overstock your tank, then the risk of having problems with nitrogen levels can increase. Lastly, I want to touch on the pH, GH and KH of these tanks. At one point last year, I was semi-obsessed with monitoring these parameters, thinking that this was the reason of all the problems I had with my orange Neocaridina shrimp colony. But over time, I've realized that they're not as critical for Neocaridina shrimp as I once thought. That said, they will definitely play some role in the health of Neocaridina shrimp, and they can be more important with other species of shrimp such as fancy Taiwan bees, but I haven't checked the pH, GH or KH of my tanks in months. Even when I moved the baby orange Neocaridina shrimp to their new tank, I only tested for nitrogen compounds and I didn't test the pH, GH or KH. This is because I've moved so many Neocaridina shrimp between my tanks in this fish room, even the ones that have different pH and GH levels, without any issue, that I just didn't see the point. And while the babies are still very small and difficult to see, I do see them feeding from time to time and they seem perfectly fine in their new home. Moving on, and we get to feeding, and I do think that this is an important part of keeping unheated shrimp tanks during the winter months, and I do think it's where a lot of mistakes are made. I've definitely been feeding my unheated shrimp tanks less food than I did during the summer, but I have added some nanofish to the tanks over the winter, so it's difficult to track the exact differences in feeding. Shrimp metabolism slows down in colder water temperatures, meaning that they require less food than in the summer months. On top of that, plants and microorganisms which help maintain safe and stable water parameters can be less effective in cooler conditions too. So adjusting your feeding schedule to match your tank's needs is essential. Thankfully, my approach is simple and very beginner friendly, and I honestly think anybody can implement it into their shrimp tank. As the water temperatures started to drop, I paid closer attention to my tanks to see if any of the food I added was left over from the previous day. If I did notice any uneaten food, I would slightly reduce the amount of food that I'd add on that day until there was no food left over the following day. Now, this method is very straightforward and easy to implement, and my shrimp have remained active and healthy, and I haven't had any water quality issues in these tanks over the winter. But if you are watching this video of part of your research for your first ever aquarium, you may see some sources say that you should remove any uneaten food from your tank within a couple of minutes. I just want to point out that that advice is usually intended for fish, and even then, in my opinion, it's still questionable, and personally I don't pay any attention to it. The amount of food that shrimp require is far less than fish, so it's unlikely that they will cause problems in an established aquarium. On top of that, shrimp tend to take longer to realize there's food in their tanks, and on top of that, their small size makes it take longer for them to break down the food and eat it, as they can't swallow the pellets whole like fish. So yes, I add my food to the tanks and then I check for leftovers the following day around 24 hours later, not a couple of minutes later like a few sources may suggest. It's also worth noting that algae can become more noticeable in cooler water, since plants and microorganisms slow down their processing, allowing some levels of excess nutrients to build up. Thankfully, the algae picks up the slack, and that's why I've just let it grow uncontrolled in my unheated tanks over the winter. But the soft algae types that do tend to grow are perfect food sources for shrimp, helping them top up their nutrient profile if needed. So overall, adjust your feeding needs to suit your shrimp, and depending on your colony size, you may not even have to add food every day. So I just want to try and wrap things up and share my overall thoughts on keeping unheated shrimp tanks. This has honestly been a great little project, and I've had a lot of fun playing around with these tanks during the winter, but the most important takeaway from this video is that all of these tanks have been a lot easier to keep than I initially expected. Social media and some forums made it seem like a really challenging task, but in reality it hasn't been difficult at all. So my advice if you are researching this type of thing is to pay attention to people who are actually showing you their unheated tanks and their shrimp colony, so you know they've definitely done it. That said, if you are an absolute beginner to shrimp keeping, I would recommend you try and build up some initial experience during the warmer months of the year first. In my opinion, this will make things easier because the beneficial microorganisms in any live plants that you keep in the tank will have higher activity rates, making it easier to maintain safe and stable water parameters in the tank. That said, I honestly believe that beginners can easily successfully keep an unheated shrimp tank. The key is to take things slow and do a little bit of planning before the colder months set in, and choose a hardy variety of Neocaridina shrimp like cherry shrimp or yellow Neocaridina. I do recommend you keep a test kit on hand so you can monitor your ammonia and nitrite levels if you are new, just to make sure there's no problems, and if there is a spike you can perform partial water changes as needed. One of the biggest benefits of unheated low-tech shrimp tanks is their energy efficiency. The price of electricity right now is crazy high, and keeping tanks without heaters helps to keep your costs as low as possible, because in most cases the heater is the most important cost of a tank. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope it's been helpful, as keeping these unheated shrimp tanks hasn't been anywhere near as difficult as I thought it might be, and thanks for watching the video. Have a good day and good luck with your shrimp tanks.